Hello, I'm Andrew White and I'm a partner here at Matheson Squire. We're a specialist intellectual property law firm, and whilst I'm today based in our office in the Shard in London, we have offices throughout the whole of the UK, including Manchester. I am a patent attorney primarily, and that means that I have a science background. So myself, I have a physics degree and PhD. I have been a patent attorney for about 13 years now, and for the last 10 or so of those, I've been doing a lot of work advising startups and scale-up businesses. Now, as part of that work, what I can do is I help mentor and advise early stage businesses, particularly when it comes to IP strategy. Now, some of the topics that arise quite frequently can include things like partnerships. It can include recognizing intellectual value versus commercial value. It can include viewing IP through the lens of risk and trade secrets and patents. And I thought I'd just touch on a few of those topics now so that you are familiar with some of these IP issues that might arise, but do feel free to reach out to me to discuss those in more detail. So one of the first things I talked about was about viewing IP through the lens of risk. And we like to discuss it that way because in reality, when it comes to risk in IP, it's very difficult to completely eliminate the risk. What we often think about really, and when it comes to early stage businesses, the exercise should really be about reducing the risk in a cost-effective way. So what's sort of the best value risk reduction you can get? So just to illustrate that point, I thought I'd just tell a quick case study. So we were working with, they were a business. They had been around for a few years, and every few years they would release a new iteration of their product. So they'd have a version 1, a version 2, version 2.5. And in each iteration of their product, there would be some slight improvements. So it would still be fundamentally the same product, but there would be a new version of that product that came out with some new bells and whistles. We worked with this client and we discussed patenting some of these improvements. And the client, they said to us, I'm not really sure about that. I think all of these improvements are obvious, I can't see the value in these, so I don't really want to protect these. Now, something else we were doing for this client is we were watching what their US competitor was doing. And as part of that exercise, we could see that they were filing quite a few patent applications and they were getting these patents granted. Now, we discussed these with our client and he was very surprised. He said, I don't understand how they've got these patents granted. To me, they're quite obvious. And we sort of pointed out to him and we said, look, maybe your threshold for what's obvious is too high. So he said, okay, fine, I accept that. And so we suggested to him that the next version of his product, he thought about filing some patent applications. So he agreed, and the next version of their product, next year, we filed a few patent applications, and over the course of a few months and years, those patent applications got granted. Now, I'm sure the client was wondering what was the value in filing those patent applications. I've got these patents granted, great, but they're just sitting there collecting dust. What was the value in those? Fast forward a few more years, and then our client and the US competitor got acquired by the same parent company. And as part of that, there was a consolidation meeting where the directors of either, both the US competitor and our client, they sat down together to talk about consolidating assets. And the director of the US company said to our client, whatever you do, don't get rid of those patents you've got granted. They're your crown jewels. They're what stopped us entering the UK market and directly competing with you. So I think that's helpful because it shows that not only can your threshold for what might be obvious be too high, you'd be quite surprised at what you might be able to get a patent granted towards, but also it's the effect that your IP has on third parties, and this is where the risk angle comes in. So our client, they had some patents granted and they didn't know, but the effect it was having on third parties, which is really powerful. They didn't have to go and sue anyone. They didn't have to actively do anything about it. The simple fact that they had some patents granted was enough to influence the decision-making process of a competitor. And the risk angle comes in here because it made it too risky to the competitor to enter the UK market and compete with our client. Potentially if they had tons of money, they could have done that, and they could have thought, do you know what, let them sue us if they want to try. But it was too much of a risk to the US competitor that it wasn't worthwhile. So I think that's quite a helpful case study. So another point I touched on was partnerships. And I think you need to be very careful when you're working with someone, whether it's a customer, whether it's a supplier, in terms of when there's any joint development work and ownership of IP. So there was a client we'd been working with. They were a startup, and they had been approached by a big multinational to basically to create a product for them. And this product was a sort of an amended version of a product that our client had already been working on, the startup had already been working on. And so our client startup, they were very excited. This was a big multinational, it's a big deal to be potentially lots of money on the table here. So our client was very excited and wanted to get to work doing this. So an NDA was signed early on, and the technical teams got to work very quickly working on this technology and seeing how it could be implemented. Now, sort of weeks went by, 10 to months, and then slightly, bit by bit, the client, so the multinational, started altering the requirement specification slightly, saying, we know we wanted it to do this, but actually can it also do this functionality as well, and can it do these other things? So that kind of stalled and slowed the product development process. And then sort of weeks turned to months, and then the project was already quite slowed down. And by this point, our client, a startup, wanted to move on to pastures new and work with other customers. Now, the challenge in doing that is because there'd been a whole bunch of IP that had been created as part of this development process. And as is the norm, sort of record keeping wasn't that great, and so it was very difficult to work out who had developed what. And even then, there were some bits that arguably had been developed by both parties. And that's a difficulty, because if our client wanted to work with someone else, which might be a competitor of the original multinational, they needed to divide out that IP. Our client couldn't incorporate IP from their, from a competitor with someone else. So we needed to delineate out who owned what IP. Now, this can be very difficult after the event and when the enthusiasm and goodwill isn't so great. So what should have really happened is there should have been an agreement in place in the early days, an IP agreement that set out the ownership of IP, and often that divides it up into the background IP, i.e. what each party had before the agreement, and then the foreground IP, and who's going to own that resulting IP. So again, that's something that I can help discuss with you and advise you on, and it's something you should definitely take into account when you're thinking about working with any third party, whether it's a customer or a partner or anyone else. Now, another point that I like to touch on is commercial value versus intellectual value. So quite often, I come across inventors, and they're very clever people, and by nature, coming up with inventions, they're very clever things. But I think what people often lose sight of is about the commercial value, because that's really where the money is going to come, not necessarily where the intellectual value lies. And when it comes to protecting your IP and formulating an IP strategy, that should really focus on the commercial value. So just to sort of illustrate that point, we had a client who they were just installing widgets, let's just call them widgets. And one day the supplier of these widgets put the price up. So our client had been purchasing them from the supplier, thought, well, why are we buying them from this supplier? Let's try and buy them from somewhere else for cheaper. So they thought about that, and they found some other suppliers and were about to do it, but then thought, let's just check, are there any patents in place here? And so, they had a little look and saw, there were a few different patents, and whilst they might not be to the elements that you might expect, there was one in particular that was important, and it affected the install time of these products. And because our client was in the business of installing these products, that had a massive impact on them, because if they didn't have this feature that was patented, the install time would be longer and the cost would be higher. And so on balance, actually, our client decided that stomaching the price rise of the product as a whole was going to be the cheaper option than having a product that didn't have this feature that they could source from elsewhere for cheaper. So there's sort of a couple of points there. One is the IP in the supply chain. Who owns the IP in that supply chain? They can dictate cost. But the other is thinking about commercial value rather than the intellectual value, because quite often you want to protect the commercial value because that's where the revenue is going to come from. And then another thing, particularly when it comes to sort of software inventions or AI-based inventions, is the interplay between trade secrets and patents. And I think many different IP strategies, they often involve a blend of different IP rights. And one of the great things about trade secrets is you don't need to spend money protecting them. But the challenge with trade secrets is not only do you have to keep them as a secret, but you also have to identify what that trade secret is. And for many businesses, things start out as trade secrets. Actually most of your IP is a trade secret, or at least confidential information in the early days. And then it might be over time that you make the decision to, right, we're going to patent this, and then it moves into the patenting domain. But there's a few things you should think about when it comes to whether you're going to keep something as a trade secret. And one of those is the reverse engineerability. If you're putting a product out there, whether it's software, whether it's a service, whether it's a physical product, can someone try and reverse engineer the product? Could they take it apart and understand how it works? Could they send enough different data queries to it to understand what's going on? The other thing to bear in mind is, practically speaking, there might be leakage of the idea over time. Staff may leave, they might take bits of information with them, you might need to disclose ideas to investors. So, can you really keep that secret over time? And the other thing to bear in mind is, even if you do keep it secret, that doesn't mean third parties can't independently develop it and patent it themselves, which could then restrict your activities greatly. So again, I can discuss that in a bit more detail with you too. So that's just a little sort of primer on some of the things that I can talk about when it comes to IP strategy. As I said, I've been working with startups for over 10 years now, very familiar with them and their requirements and also their sort of unique constraints. So please do feel free to get in touch. Again, my name is Andrew White. I'm at Mathis & Squire, and my email address is ajwhite@mathis, that's MATHYS -Squire, SQUIRE.com. Thank you.